wanted to do in this presentation is to tell you a story. Scientists have a story, of course, about Mars, and they've modelled it on the story of the Earth. In fact, they've already decided on the equivalent of the geological ages of the Earth for Mars. They have the Amazonian period and that kind of thing. In other words, all they've done is to transfer the story of the Earth to Mars. What I want to do is to alert you to the fact that there's a spacecraft which is due to arrive at Mars in September, which is aimed at answering questions that the story that the scientists believe about Mars is correct, and they want to try and learn about the reason why Mars lost its water. There is this belief that there was a time when Mars was much like the Earth, but they want to find out what went wrong. I'm here to tell you that whatever conclusions they draw, it will be based on wrong ideas. So the opportunity is there for you in this audience, after I've told my story of Mars, to be able to compare it later this year with the kinds of stories that come out of NASA and ESA. So to make it clear what this particular spacecraft is supposed to do, I have a video which will, I hope, explain it.
Billions of years ago, when the planets of our solar system were still young, Mars was a very different world. Liquid water flowed in long rivers that emptied into lakes and shallow seas. A thick atmosphere blanketed the planet and kept it warm. In this cozy environment, living microbes might have found a home, starting Mars down the path toward becoming a second life-filled planet next door to our own. But that's not how things turned out. Today, Mars is bitter cold and desiccated. The planet's thin, wispy atmosphere provides scant cover for a surface marked by dry riverbeds and empty lakes. If Martian microbes still exist, they're probably eking out a meager existence somewhere beneath the dusty Martian soil. What happened? This haunting question has long puzzled scientists. To find the answer, NASA is sending a new orbiter to Mars, called MAVEN. The goal of MAVEN is to figure out what processes were responsible for those changes in Martian climate, says Bruce Jakosky, principal investigator for MAVEN at the University of Colorado at Boulder. Scheduled for launch in November 2013 and due to arrive in September 2014, MAVEN is bristling with instruments to study Mars' upper atmosphere. That's where many researchers believe the answer lies. The only way Mars could have been wet and warm 4 billion years ago is if it also had a thick atmosphere. CO2 in the Martian atmosphere is a greenhouse gas, just as it is in our own atmosphere. A thick blanket of CO2 and other greenhouse gases would have provided the warmer temperatures and greater atmospheric pressure required to keep liquid water from freezing solid or boiling away. Somehow, Mars lost most of that blanket. One possibility is the solar wind. Unlike Earth, Mars is not protected by a global magnetic field. Instead, it has magnetic umbrellas scattered around the planet that shelter only part of the atmosphere. Erosion of exposed areas by solar wind might have slowly stripped the atmosphere away over billions of years. Recent measurements of isotopes in the Martian atmosphere by the Mars rover Curiosity support this idea. Light isotopes of hydrogen and argon are depleted compared to their heavier counterparts, suggesting that they have been lost to space. Scientists have also speculated that the planet's surface might have absorbed the CO2 and locked it up in minerals such as carbonate. However, while carbonates have been found on the surface, they aren't present in enough abundance to account for an early, thick atmosphere. MAVEN will be the first mission to Mars specifically designed to help scientists understand the ongoing escape of CO2 and other gases into space. The probe will orbit Mars for at least one Earth year. At the elliptical orbit's low point, MAVEN will be 125 kilometers above the surface. Its high point will take it more than 6,000 kilometers out into space. MAVEN's instruments will track ions and molecules in this broad cross-section of the Martian atmosphere. thoroughly documenting the flow of CO2 and other molecules into space for the first time. MAVEN's instruments also will measure the solar energetic inputs into the Martian upper atmosphere and the atmospheric response. This will allow us to determine the processes that are responsible for that loss to space. Once Joukowsky and his colleagues know how quickly Mars is losing CO2 right now and what might be causing that loss, they can extrapolate backward in time to estimate the total amount lost during the last 4 billion years. MAVEN will determine if loss to space was the most important player in driving Martian climate change, Joukowsky says. In the grand scheme of the solar system, Earth orbits alongside a world that began with as much promise for life as our own, yet turned out so differently. After all these years, MAVEN could write the final chapter in a haunting planetary mystery.
What we have here are a whole string of wrong ideas about Mars, the history of the solar system, the history of the Earth, and the recent history of these planets. So this 4.6 billion year old clockwork solar system is a myth. Of course, by studying mostly meteorites and using radioactive dating techniques, specifically looking at daughter isotopes, scientists think they have determined that the solar system is 4.6 billion years old. But this requires that the solar system has not been disturbed to any great degree since it was formed. It also relies on the idea that it was formed in the way that was advertised, and that is via a nebula. What I want to do in this talk is to show you that the story is completely different, and it's much more interesting than the fairy tale we've been taught. No theory of planet formation works, but that doesn't stop us seeing and hearing through the media the familiar story about the 4.6 billion year old formation of the planets. In the case of the Earth, there's all these unanswered questions. Why do we have an atmosphere of oxygen? Where did all the nitrogen come from? And why do we have so much water? In fact, why is there so much sodium chloride in the water? None of these questions are really answered by the standard theory. A speculative story of Earth's history involving catastrophic extinctions has been concocted. And as I said, Mars has a fabricated history too, with the Amazonian and the Noachian periods. The electric universe accepts evidence that petroglyphs are an enduring record of the frightening collapse of a former cosmos. And this is the starting point of this new story. It has taken 10,000 years for us to be able to see in laboratory plasma discharge experiments what our forebears saw in awesome cosmic proportions in the sky. I would say that petroglyphs are the Rosetta Stones of the recent history of the solar system. The monumental effort involved in carving them shows that what was happening in the celestial arena was of paramount concern to the prehistoric artists. It was a concern that still has echoes in our doomsday nightmares. Velikovsky challenged astronomers again at the 1974 AAAS ambush in San Francisco. He said, "I was greatly surprised to find that astronomy, the queen of sciences, lives still in the pre-Faraday age, not even in the time of kerosene lamps, but candles and oil. Nothing has changed, so powerful is the Newtonian ideology." The evidential history is quite different, and this story is built on the evidence, looking at it from the point of view of Velikovsky and those mytho-historians like David Talbot, Eduardo Cardona and F. Cochran, who have extended his research. The first thing is that to deal with is the idea that Saturn had a former state as a brown dwarf. And a brown dwarf is not actually a dwarf star in the electric universe. It is quite huge. The planets, Saturn's entourage of satellites and planets, actually existed within a vast glowing plasmasphere. For instance, it's been said that if we could witness Jupiter's plasmasphere from the Earth when it's in opposition, it would appear the size of the full moon or the sun in the sky. So if you can imagine proto-Saturn having that kind of size, all of the satellites of Saturn, and also if you were to apply that to Jupiter, those inner satellites would all be within that plasmasphere. Brown dwarfs flare, and this is a surprise to astronomers because they're supposed to be failed stars. They shouldn't have the energy to flare, but they do. So they must dump matter on their satellites. And this can be an answer to many conundrums about the formation of the planets. Water, we know that Saturn, the rings of Saturn are water ice, so here is the origin of the water for the Earth. Oxygen, reddish light, low gravity, gave rise to the Earth's plant and animal gigantism, the era of megafauna and megaflora. Evidence of the breakup of this earlier system, given in Symbols of an Alien Sky and Eduardo Cardona's Star series of books, has been around for some years now and is available for research for those who would like to test these ideas against what the MAVEN mission finds. And of course, as we've seen, the hard evidence of the thunderbolts between planets, which sculpted the Martian surface, came from high-energy plasma experiments. So this is a summary. Earth and Mars were planets orbiting a brown dwarf star in a previous life. You could say that we are the aliens in this solar system. It was the most hospitable environment for life. And this is something that astronomers have come to recognise in recent years. However, they still talk about a Goldilocks zone. If a planet orbiting around a faint dwarf star or a red dwarf star is in a particular orbit, it can harbour life. What I'm saying is different. The electric universe proposes that the real environment for life is within the actual glowing, huge envelope of these red stars. The atmosphere, water and minerals are deposited, and this can explain layering of moons and planets. The system broke up on encountering the sun, and I will describe this in detail. And interplanetary thunderbolts stripped the surface of Mars. So let's talk, we've presented quite a bit of material in this conference about stars and planets forming in cosmic thunderbolts. So we can expect that the Earth and Mars and Saturn, or proto-Saturn as we call it in its stellar form, were formed in one of these cosmic lightning bolts in a molecular cloud, close enough together so that once the discharge abated, they were able to form a small planetary system. Now, one of the things about stars formed in this model, and it refers both to Don Scott's presentation and also to Markland convection, as Don said, the heavy elements concentrate at the centre of these discharges. So the cores of stars are composed of heavy elements. That's not hydrogen. So there can be no hydrogen fusion at the centre of the sun or of any star. They all have cool, heavy element cores. In the electric universe model, and I've written about this on my website, electricity plays a central role in both the capture and the stabilisation of orbits, so that capture is far more likely in the electric universe than in the gravitational universe. In fact, this is one of the difficulties that astronomers had to deal with early on, was that a body passing by the sun will normally just swing past it and then off again. There's nothing to reduce the energy of the incoming object so that it is captured. But in the electric universe, as I will discuss, that is possible. In fact, it's likely. The other thing is that one of the big puzzles that have affected planetary scientists in recent years with the discovery of so many so-called exoplanets, that is planets around nearby stars, is that they found these hot Jupiters orbiting the central star extremely closely, some of them going around in a matter of hours or days. There is another aspect of the formation of stars, and that is that if an instability occurs during the formation of the star, as I discussed the other day, each celestial body has an internal electric field, positive charge towards the centre, negative charge at the surface. If you can imagine, if the centre of the object is positively charged and there's a slight displacement, then there is an accelerating electric force which can actually cause the object to fission. And this may be the explanation for why stars exist in a narrow range of sizes. This is also not explained well by the gravitational story. So, in the electric universe, brown dwarfs are not failed stars, too low in mass to sustain hydrogen fusion reactions. As I said, there are no hydrogen fusion reactions. Stars are powered electrically. Red dwarfs, shining brightest in infrared, represent about 70% of the stars in the Milky Way. So these are the most likely places to find life. Those faint dwarf stars might be called the galaxy's, silent majority. But red dwarfs come with a major drawback. Their stellar radii are hard to determine accurately, and this is where the astronomers have missed the point, that red dwarfs are not dwarf stars. They are huge. All red stars are huge, for the simple reason that a star that is not capable of attracting sufficient electrons to satisfy the current demands of their electrical environment will expand their photosphere. In fact, the red dwarfs and so on don't actually have a bright photosphere. So the plasma sheath around them expands until it can intercept sufficient electrons to maintain the discharge. These pictures here of red stars, you can see some of the stars are so big, the giant ones, that they can be measured from the Earth. Betelgeuse is a good example, which its envelope would actually reach to the orbit of Jupiter. So in that particular case, if Betelgeuse does have satellites, they are orbiting within that red glowing sphere. Now, brown dwarf is no different. You don't have to have different models for different stars in the electric universe. So a brown dwarf is a small star with a very large glowing envelope. Jupiter, the gas giants and so on, if you like, if Jupiter and Saturn were now taken outside the solar system, they would once again become brown dwarfs. In December 2008, NASA found that the brightness of a nearby brown dwarf at 17 light years distance was twice that expected for a brown dwarf with its particular temperature. This is using the standard model of stars. So the solution, completely ad hoc, the object must have twice the surface area, it must be twins. Now the electric universe says, I mean, that is just an amazing ad hoc solution. The spectra of red dwarfs are crowded with molecular absorption features that are not well understood. So it's hard to extract the physical properties of a given red dwarf from its spectrum. That is also interesting. But the fact that there are so many molecular absorption features indicates that all of the requirements for life exist within that glowing envelope. So, all stars are electric. All red stars are gigantic. Planets can orbit within their anode glow, and even astronomers acknowledge that. They have suggested that there could be satellites orbiting within the Betelgeuse glow. However, with their notion that the red giant is formed by an ultra-hot core, those planets would not be suitable for life. In the electric universe, it has a cool core. Objects orbiting within the red envelope are suitable for life. Now, one of the very interesting things is that there are no seasons on any satellites orbiting within that red sphere, because the energy received on any body within that sphere is equal over the entire surface of that body. So that a planet orbiting within that red sphere has no seasons, even temperatures. In fact, I would say that brown dwarfs are the cosmic wombs of life in the universe. One of the interesting facts, of course, that would suddenly come out of this is that these red spheres are glowing plasma, and glowing plasma will not let radio waves pass through. So the search for extraterrestrial intelligence using radio waves is, in my opinion, a wasted effort, because anyone living on a satellite inside one of these glowing red wombs would not even be aware that there was a greater universe out there full of stars, let alone try and use radio, because any radio signals would not pierce that plasma. Just an interesting side issue here. So this is my view of proto-Saturn, and I've just put 2 satellites there, but there are obviously more. Titan, for instance, would have been one of the satellites. Earth and Mars. So there they are inside this glowing shell, and the evidence of the earliest recollections of mankind appears to be that the purple dawn of creation was the skylight. That was the colour of the sky, purple dawn. And that is precisely the colour you would expect in this circumstance, because you have the red end of the spectrum, and you also have a certain amount of the violet and ultraviolet light due to electrical activity in the plasma. So this fits with the, if you like, the earliest recollections of mankind, that was our environment. 50% of red dwarfs have Earth-sized planets in their habitable zone. Remember I said that astronomers feel this is the place where life is most likely to be found. Now if you look at Jupiter, for instance, and consider that as a red dwarf, and its plasma sphere was lit up, Io has a 1.75 day orbit, Europa has a 3.5 day orbit, Ganymede 7 days and Callisto 17 days. Any of the satellites that were released from Jupiter's grip would have a rotation rate which equaled their daily rotation rate, because they're locked always with the same face towards the central body. It suggests that the Earth and Mars had orbits which were about a day in length. This is the kind of information that you can get from this kind of model. The other thing is, you'll notice in this diagram, there is no Venus. So we have a huge red anode glow, which was what we call proto-Saturn. We had a purple dawn of creation and no Venus. These are the important things to understand about proto-Saturn. Just recently, a map of a nearby red dwarf was produced using a Doppler imaging technique. It's one of a pair of red dwarfs near Alpha Centauri with a separation of 3 astronomical units. There's a bright near-polar region which can be clearly seen in the upper right panels, and a darker mid-latitude area visible in the lower left panels is consistent with large-scale cloud inhomogeneities. However, that's an assumption that what we're looking at is an atmosphere, but we're not looking at an atmosphere, we're looking at a plasma sheath. So this variation said in the electric universe model would be due to objects orbiting within that plasma sheath, either inside or outside that plasma sheath, because that would affect the discharge. The other thing is that this bright spot towards the pole is the same kind of thing that's found at Betelgeuse, the red giant, which indicates that that's the electrical connection with the Birkeland currents that drive these particular stars. If I'm right, the patterns here should be more repetitive than weather patterns and without banding like Jupiter, which is undetectable so far by this technique, but you never know what they can do tomorrow. Red dwarfs and giants change in radius, which is not the kind of thing that you would expect if this is a normal body. However, this change in radius is the star's response to changes in its electrical environment. It's quite natural. It's a plasma effect. They also tend to flicker in brightness. All of this is indicative of a star lacking the stabilising effect of the bright photosphere of bright stars. That's according to Don Scott's transistor model. That is a stabilising influence in all bright stars. Red stars don't have that luxury. Proto-Saturn's capture. This is the interesting part of it. This took me decades to try and figure out, because the model of planets arranged with their poles in a line is unstable. There's no Newtonian theory to explain a daisy chain of planets. So it eventually dawned on me that what we had was a dynamic arrangement where proto-Saturn, which is in this diagram over here, that's proto-Saturn, and you can just see a few little brighter red dots behind it. They are the Earth and Mars and other satellites. That's meant to represent those satellites. The explanation came to me once I had realised that the stabilisation of the planetary orbits as we see them today, why is the Newtonian system a clockwork system, or it appears to be a clockwork system, when you only have one force? Well, the answer is you cannot have a stable system with one force. There has to be a feedback mechanism. And as I explained the other day, you can change the mass of a planet or a star by either placing charge on it or taking charge away. And it occurred to me that a small star like Proto-Saturn entering the environment of the Sun would suffer a drastic change in its electrical environment, with a result, actually, that Proto-Saturn would have become one gigantic comet, because a body which is negatively charged with respect to its environment is a cometary body, and a body that's positively charged with respect to its environment is an anode in the discharge, and it is a star. So this was a change, a sudden change, once Proto-Saturn approached the solar system at that time closely. At least it would have been most drastic once it entered the heliosphere, the boundary of the Sun's environment with interstellar space. So Saturn as a comet is removing electrons, and the result is that it is losing mass, it's accelerating towards the Sun. The bodies behind it, actually, sorry, I got that around the wrong way. The Proto-Saturn itself is losing electrons, as comets do. They are being passed on to its satellites. The satellites are gaining in mass. Saturn is losing in mass. Conservation of energy says that Proto-Saturn accelerates towards the Sun, and this is part of the electrical capture mechanism. The Earth and Mars and the other satellites gaining in mass will tend to fall behind and line up, rather like Comet Shoemaker Levy 9. The electrical discharge, the polar discharge, in my opinion then, is the central column of Saturn's cometary discharge. We were sitting in this cometary tail, right in the middle of it. And all of the plasma discharge effects that were witnessed by the ancients and chiselled into rock come from that period of capture. I've said as a cometary body, Proto-Saturn loses electrons, it accelerates towards the Sun. All of this could explain all of the plasma phenomena, discharge phenomena, recounted by Dave Talbot and Eduardo Cardona. The latest measurements by Pitieva and Standish suggest the astronomical unit is increasing about 23 feet per century. That means that the Earth is actually, its orbit is shifting over time. But according to the beliefs of astronomers, the astronomical unit shouldn't change at all. The mechanism I'm describing for the modification of gravity provides a mechanism that can be tested, because the Earth's orbit expansion should be a discontinuous function with discrete jumps following major solar storms and at Venus's inferior conjunction, when we sit in the cometary tail of Venus. So there are various means of testing these ideas too, outrageous as they may seem. This is Saturn. In June 2004, I posted on my website Cassini's Homecoming, before the Cassini mission began to send all of the detailed information back about Saturn. And I wrote back then, a scenario follows that is so alien to any conventional theory of Saturn's history that it should be easily tested against any information gained from the Cassini mission. It shows striking connections between many seemingly unrelated facts about certain planets. Because if the planets that I mentioned were part of the same family in the past, we should be able to see family resemblances. That is something that conventional cosmogony has not been able to do. That was the end of the quote. For instance, the tilt of Saturn at 27 degrees to the ecliptic plane is itself an enigma unless it formed independently from the Sun. The axial tilts of Saturn, Earth and Mars are very similar. The short-lived rings of water ice, it's been said by astronomers that they shouldn't last for any length of time, geologically speaking, and yet here they are, brilliant. And as I said before, it gives us a clue as to the origin of all of the water on Earth. We come to Titan because Titan has been examined closely in recent years, and it also had the Huygens probe, which landed on the surface. And I was very pleased that happened because I predicted what would be found beneath the clouds, and I was proven correct. Before the spacecraft descended to the surface, it was thought that Titan must be covered in a methane ocean, simply because methane is found in the atmosphere of Titan, and it cannot have been there for 4 billion years because it's dissipated continuously. But if Titan lost its place in its original birthplace only a few thousand years ago, then it hasn't had time to lose this methane. Before the Huygens lander pierced the clouds and we could see the surface for the first time, I said that Titan would have a surface that looked like the Earth or Mars, and that was proven correct. There wasn't an ocean of methane. Also, it has an enigmatic, thick nitrogen atmosphere. It has a very thick nitrogen atmosphere. And when you think about it, the Earth has mostly nitrogen in its atmosphere. There's no good explanation for why that should be so. So we come to Titan's big brother, us. Brown dwarfs are noted for flaring. That is, they suddenly brighten and appear to eject material. As I said, that's the only way they have to adjust to their electrical environment. The flare ejects stellar material from the brown dwarf equatorially, preferentially, or axially if it's really serious. So its satellites have solids, liquids and gases rain down on them. The composition will vary depending on the depth from which matter was dredged up from the star and the orbital encounter of the stream of matter with each satellite, because it comes out in a stream. This helps explain the layering seen on solid planets, moons, asteroids and comets, and it can explain global mineral strata on the Earth. Venus is interesting. Its rotation is anomalous, its heat is anomalous, its atmosphere is anomalous. Venus's slow retrograde rotation and odd axial tilt are, in my opinion, due to ejection from proto-Saturn, as observed and recorded by the ancients. Venus shows a surprisingly young surface, and this is a quote from one of the early reports. So the astronomers then had the problem, maybe it's been resurfaced, and so that was the explanation. Venus underwent some drastic resurfacing in recent times. But there's no need for that if it's newborn. The other thing that's obvious in this picture is this belt of scars around the equator. But the ancients also witnessed planet-girdling filamentary scars. Well, they didn't witness the scars, but they saw the discharge in the sky. And this is obvious in Dave Talbot's reconstructions with those radiating streams. And remember, we were underneath the pole of Venus at that time, so those streams are coming from the equator. And they are typical of electrical scars from lightning through a thick atmosphere. The electrical universe account explains many odd things about Venus. Its hellish temperature, it was born from the cool star, proto-Saturn. So this gives you an idea of the kind of temperature of the core of a star, like a red dwarf. It has a thick 96% carbon dioxide and 4% nitrogen atmosphere, plus a few hydrocarbons. It also has some water in the atmosphere, but strangely the water decreases until it becomes extremely dry near the surface. And this is a puzzle. If you think about it, you've got a surface which is of red-hot minerals, and you've got this thick atmosphere of nitrogen. It was Louis Kervran, the French scientist, who in years gone by showed that nitrogen on a red-hot iron surface can actually be transmuted to carbon monoxide. And there's a process that was used some time in the past to produce hydrogen for burning home fuel, which used heat, carbon monoxide and water, and the water is split to form carbon dioxide and hydrogen. The hydrogen is lost to space, and the carbon dioxide, or the nitrogen which was once Venus's atmosphere, is now carbon dioxide. The process is still going on because the water disappears near the surface where the reaction takes place. So the Venusian atmosphere is an altered version of Titan's atmosphere, where nitrogen has been converted to carbon monoxide and then to carbon dioxide. Because the atmosphere is so much thicker than that on Earth, Venus's total nitrogen is actually 4 times more than the Earth. Let's get back to battle-scarred Mars, and this will sort of lead into the next presentation by Steve Smith. The evidence of Mars' battles with cosmic thunderbolts is written hugely on its scar face. And I wrote many years ago now that the huge scar here, which extends about a third of the way around the planet, is actually in the form of the most prevalent and most colossal electric discharge in the universe, that of a barred spiral galaxy. So Mars was stripped of rocks, atmosphere and water. The form of a barred spiral is there. That's just the central part of a spiral galaxy. And the pattern I recognised, because this puzzled me for decades, is how did you actually form that huge gash on the planet? And it appears that it came in the form of twin Birkeland currents, which are the central axis of a barred spiral. And the pattern on Mars is exactly the same, where you get the pattern becomes chaotic up towards the left and down here. This is the chaos region, and it extends all the way down here. Up here you get all these giant channels which come all the way up here. So this is a pattern of a gigantic electrical discharge. And of course this will rip material off the surface and eject it into space. We're still receiving Mars rocks on Earth today, and there's no good explanation for that in terms of impact, because you would expect that the material would be vaporised rather than forming rocks. This poor planet was severely damaged because it was acted like an oscillating charge carrier. It was between Proto-Saturn, you had Proto-Saturn, Venus, Mars and Earth, and Mars would move up towards Venus, get zapped, if you like to put it that way, and then carry the charge down to the Earth, where it would discharge to the Earth. This is why it was regarded as a colossal threat and the god of war, because it was the planet that did most of the charge transfer to the Earth. But in the process of charge transfer, it ripped the surface apart. But if you remember, and this is important, it occupied a similar place to the Earth in the cosmic womb of Proto-Saturn. So it's quite likely that it had an environment pre the catastrophes that was very much like the Earth's. So we have misunderstood Mars. This is an artist's impression of an early wet Mars. Late Hesperian, this is one of these other so-called geological eras on Mars, mythical ones. The outflow channels are shown. But of course they may be correct insofar as there was probably water on Mars because it occupied Proto-Saturn's environment. The geologic history of Mars from oldest to youngest are the Noachian, the Hesperian and the Amazonian. They are defined by the number of meteorite impact craters, and here we run into the problem of what kind of craters are they really. If they're electrical craters, they cannot be used for dating. But the electric universe shows that hemispheric cratering, northern hemisphere, as kilometres of matter being removed from the northern hemisphere. All of this can happen in a single cataclysm. Martian geological history is a myth. The Mars Atmosphere and Volatile Evolution, or MAVEN mission, is to study the loss of atmosphere today and extrapolate backwards over 4 billion years to figure out what happened to make the Martian environment so different to the Earth's. I predict the evidence will make no sense for the conventional evolutionary story, but that will not be enough to discard it. The comforting dogma of evolution in place for 4 billion years requires extraordinary disproof. What will scientists do when lazy retrocalculation and speculation are discredited by proof of sudden catastrophe and links to other members of its original family? So strong is the attachment to the old fairy tale that I'm confident ad hoc adjustments will be made and anomalies filed away to be figured out someday or forgotten. As the philosopher David Stove wrote, Newtonian physics is a guarantee against the occurrence of just about anything disagreeable. The irony for us is that Mars was more Earth-like within the time of modern humans on Earth. After all, until recently we shared the same cosy stellar womb. Life on Mars should have stood an equal chance before the hapless small planet became both a ruddy symbol and a casualty of celestial war. Shrapnel from those prehistoric battles still arrive on Earth today. The story of Mars is far more dramatic and catastrophic than anything dreamt up by theorists or imagined by science fiction writers. Our challenge will be to make sense of data from the MAVEN mission that conforms to the evidence gleaned from prehistoric eyewitnesses of Martian events. They were events beyond all Newtonian imagining. Thank you.